Hello, and welcome back to another eco-spirituality session. As you probably know, my name is Michael Fenn, and this time the theme of this session is meekness. And like last time, we will learn what that means as we go through it. Alright, so I'm going to try not to overload and bore you with the biology, but here we go. I thought this was cool, important biology to know to inform our sense of meekness. So ecology is a pretty common term, but just real quick, just to define it, it's how species interact at any point in time, and this includes animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, algae, any kind of interaction between species and their surroundings. And it's a very wide field of study with many different subsets. And so ecological succession, as is on the slide, can be thought about as ecology over time. So ecosystems have regular levels of disturbance, such as trees falling, small fires, or even sometimes beetle outbreaks that are part of a dynamic equilibrium. And what's important here is that these are healthy changes over time that are predictable for a given ecosystem. So for the woodlands here, oftentimes small fires are a very natural part of the ecosystem. But back east, that would not be the case. Back east, we have maybe periods of beetle outbreaks, small beetle outbreaks that are a natural part of the ecosystem. Occasionally, this does go to extremes, and can seem like quite a catastrophe. And at times, it is quite a catastrophe. And these kinds of disturbances are usually much more major, and they are linked to anthropocentric causes, either directly or indirectly. And the causes can be things like improper forest management, mining, or clear cutting. And these events can be essentially exaggerated versions occasionally of what I talked about earlier. So really large fires or really devastating beetle outbreaks that kill most trees rather than a few weak ones. And so as an example, the Benson mines were an iron mine in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, and it's a quote-unquote orphan mine that fell through the legal systems for ecological restoration. Essentially, after the mine closed down, it deposited 30 feet of completely sterile, inorganic mining waste on miles and miles of forests and completely destroyed that stretch of habitat in the Adirondacks. And so it is a very devastated habitat. And what's important about these Benson mines and moss and meekness is that these certain species of moss were the first species to recolonize these extremely hostile, sterile, inorganic sites. These species were tenacious and persistent where many other organisms cannot be. And they actually have made way for larger and larger plants to establish, and by that establishment of larger plants, larger animals are coming back as well. And the way that they do this is very unique in that they hold water in very small amounts of nutrients, and gradually they provide that kind of safe, moist place for seeds of larger plants to germinate and for bugs to live. And I trust the Yellowstone fires need no introduction to those watching in Wyoming, but just in case, I will give a very brief introduction. In 1988, a wildfire in Yellowstone affected 36% of the parklands and closed the park to visitors for the first time since its inception. The fire itself caused what's called a secondary succession event, where organic matter was still present and the seed bank was not destroyed. I know that sounds like a good thing, and to some extent it is. There are still other issues that are posed in this kind of event, erosion being one of them. Erosion can cause really large problems in places where it occurs. The topsoil can get leached away by wind and water. However, mosses and other small organisms after this fire colonized these sites where erosion may have occurred and locked in many layers of soil and nutrients so that they would not be pulled away. All right, and then I will touch upon two other topics of moss's importance to ecosystems outside of these catastrophic events. So in forest ecology, mosses are important species in ecological interactions. They provide nursery habitats for plants and animals where seeds of young plants can germinate and grow in safety, and eggs of bugs can be laid to experience their adolescence in the safety of these moss cushions. They also mitigate the water and nutrient cycle. In ecosystems with a high amount of moss biomass, they can store up to a canopy's worth of water and thus mitigate the water cycle and allow it to happen at a more, I guess, leisurely pace. And they can add a lot of usable water to ecosystems by harnessing morning and evening dew. So morning and evening dew will alight on plants, and mosses have, again, that unique ability to draw water from the air because they do not have a cuticle. And so they actually can add water that would be unavailable to ecosystems in that way. Lastly, the sphagnum group of mosses. It's a genus of mosses characterized largely by its ability to form bogs. And bogs are critical for mediating climate change. I think about these meek, tiny organisms creating a habitat that stores exponentially more carbon than any other kind of habitat. And bioengineered sphagnum is actually being utilized or studied to be utilized to lower pollution in city environments. All right, I am done with my science, and so now I will explore the faith behind the sense of meekness of moss species. So to me, what speaks is that I see myself as capable only of a very small amount of things, quote unquote, as I stand. I can't go and flip a switch and make the world a happy place for everyone. I can't generate world peace or make fuel prices go down, but I can volunteer my time or do stuff for the sewing circle, sew blankets for babies or knit scarves and whatnot. Or I can make someone feel welcome at the thrift store that I work at. And to me, I have to have faith that those small actions mean something bigger to the ecosystem that I am a part of. Just as moss harnesses small amounts of water or provides a nursery for bugs and stuff like that, I have to trust that my small actions impact my larger ecosystem. And obviously biblical allegory abounds here as well. God raises up the meek. Jesus was born into a humble, meek beginning, and stuff like that as well. So again, I shared quotes from Gathering Moss to discuss with the group, so I will share and talk a little bit about the quotes here. So this first quote: "The collection from a burr-leaf funnel might typically produce the following results. 1 gram of moss from the forest floor, a piece about the size of a muffin, would harbor 150,000 protozoa, 132,000 tardigrades, 3,000 springtails, 800 rotifers, 500 nematodes, 400 mites, and 200 fly larvae. These numbers tell us something about the astounding quantity of life in a handful of moss." So this quote kind of reminds me of feeding of the 5,000, this very small, humble thing that provides so much more than can be thought of in many ways. And when I actually experienced this for the first time doing my undergraduate studies, it was a little, gross and creepy because, you open this lush green cushion and all of a sudden these little tiny gross things are coming out. So the second quote is also from Gathering Moss, and it says, "I can stick the blade of my Swiss Army knife into the turf and slice out a neat column of sand, several inches deep, with a cap of moss at the top. The sand below the moss is darkly tinted. This tiny amount of accumulated organic matter may slow the passage of water and subtly increase the pool of soil nutrients." So the context of this quote that I would like to provide is the author and a fellow scientist are sitting in a grove of aspens at the site of the Benson mines, and I misspoke. They're not sitting in the grove of aspens, they're just sitting working on a patch of moss to study it. And so she cuts out this column of moss while she's doing this. And this quote kind of reminds me vaguely of a promised land. So this quote speaks to this promise of richness and safety to come by this slow persistence and slow action. This tiny amount of organic matter, going on to produce much more, reminds me of sort of that promise of a promised land. Okay, so this quote actually, the context of this quote is what I had misspoken earlier, and this is when the author and that same scientist, who's also a friend, were sitting in a grove of aspen at the part of the Benson mines that had been, quote unquote, successfully rehabilitated. So this quote says, "Brushing aside the leaf litter, we uncovered the remnants of polytrichum. The first plants began healing the land, making it possible for others to follow. In the deepening shade, they'll soon be replaced, having done their work. This island of trees is a legacy of mosses pioneering on the tailings." So this quote didn't necessarily remind me of any biblical imagery or story, but to me was such a beautiful concept of lives lived and the succession and the beauty that comes from that. Someone in the class, I remember on Sunday, said something that kind of caught me off guard. They said that this reminded them sort of the early Christian martyrs who died and to establish a more welcoming environment for the Christians that came later, and generation by generation, Christians create an environment that allows future generations to flourish. And just like the last session, I had some reflection questions that we did not get to, but I will save them right now, and maybe you can take them and reflect on them throughout your week. So, how can small actions create positive change? How can my small actions create positive change? As we saw in the Benson mines, certain species are naturally able to persist where others cannot, and they can create an environment that allows others to grow. How can we model this in our own lives? How can we be persistent naturally where others cannot? And then lastly, on sort of a related note, how can I create an environment that allows others to grow with me, just as mosses allow other plants to grow, to germinate in them and with them? All right, and that is the end of my second session. I hope you will join me for the next few sessions on Sunday mornings, or catch up on Facebook or YouTube. Thank you.